The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the sleepy streets of Falls Glen, Virginia, where the warm light filtered through maple leaves and painted a picturesque scene over the small-town charm that residents proudly called home. But in the quiet rhythm of that evening, where wind chimes sang faintly from porches and the distant scent of barbecues wafted through backyards, a routine call disrupted everything. "Suspicious man loitering near Mason's Hardware." Armed came the voice-over dispatch, flat and certain, as if the suspicion itself was enough to sound alarms. And within moments, Officers Briggs and Danner were rolling through the narrow side street, tires crunching over gravel and red-blue lights washing over white clapboard storefronts that hadn't changed in 50 years. Their patrol car pulling up to a scene that to them looked loaded with threat. A solitary man in his late 30s, lean, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black hoodie faded from age and a pair of worn jeans, leaning motionless against a matte black motorcycle parked just shy of the curb, arms folded, head slightly down, posture entirely still in a way that made both officers nervous, because it didn't radiate fear or confusion, but calm, the kind of calm you didn't see from someone who might have been up to no good, the kind of calm that hinted at control, confidence, awareness, the kind that unsettled men used to panic and guilt. Officer Briggs exited first, hand already resting on his holstered sidearm, eyes sharp, voice raised to full authority, hands where I can see them, and the man did exactly that, slowly, deliberately, raising his hands with a sigh, as if he'd done this before and knew the exact tempo of compliance that kept tension just below critical. Yet even then the officers didn't ask questions or request ID. They stepped forward, rifles of authority cocked and loaded with assumption, and forced him face down on the pavement, the gritty edge of the sidewalk digging into his cheek as Danner wrenched his arms behind his back and slapped on the cuffs with a mechanical rhythm, searching him for weapons, finding nothing but a folding pocketknife and a small laminated card clipped inside his wallet, which neither of them bothered to read because this wasn't a scene about truth or patience or protocols. It was about perceived threat and control, and once control was established, facts became a distant second to optics. Logan Taylor said nothing, just stared ahead, cheek to the pavement, breaths slow and measured, eyes fixed on the darkening sky above the storefront awning. And when Briggs yanked him to a seated position against the cruiser's bumper and barked, "Name," he answered plainly, voice low but clear, "Taylor, Chief Petty Officer Logan Taylor." And that was when Briggs sneered, "Don't play smart. What are you doing here?" And Logan, wise enough to know silence was safer than logic in moments like this, said nothing more because he'd been in war zones where tense men with guns made worse decisions with less provocation. And in his experience, the battlefield sometimes looked a lot like home, only the uniforms were different. Inside his weathered military-issue backpack, just inches from where Danner had dropped it on the curb, sat his Navy ID with full credentials, a laminated certificate identifying him as a Naval Special Warfare sniper, and a polished Medal of Valor awarded for an operation that had saved the lives of 11 hostages during a classified mission overseas. But none of those things mattered in that moment because no one looked, no one asked, and no one thought a man dressed plainly, keeping to himself on a street corner, could possibly be someone who had served his country in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. As Logan sat cuffed, back against the bumper, legs stretched in front of him, passersby began to gather, some with concerned looks, others with subtle phones raised, filming from across the street or behind parked cars, whispering to each other, speculating. What did he do? Is that a gun on the ground? He doesn't look like a thug, but you never know these days. And Logan remained silent through it all, not because he didn't want to defend himself or because he was numb to the humiliation, but because he understood something most people didn't. The world often judged the surface and never the substance, and this moment wasn't new to him. It had different scenery, yes, but the script was familiar, and the cost of speaking out while cuffed, especially when no one was listening, wasn't worth the energy. The sun continued to fade as the town's lights flickered on neon signs buzzing to life in diners and taverns, street lamps casting dull halos around parked cars, and, in the midst of it all, a man who had once tracked warlords through mountain ranges, who had lain motionless for 72 hours in sniper hides, who had pulled brothers from burning Humvees under enemy fire, now sat restrained and disregarded by men who thought their authority gave them the right to decide guilt without evidence, threat without action, and identity without inquiry. And still, Logan waited, not for justice, he didn't expect that, but for a moment, just one, when someone might look beyond the black hoodie, the silent posture, and the motorcycle, and wonder who he really was beneath the surface everyone else refused to see. For nearly an hour, Logan sat silently in the cold fluorescent buzz of the Falls Glen Police Department's holding room. His cuffs finally removed, but his dignity still shackled to the concrete perception that had followed him from the sidewalk to the station. His every move scrutinized under the thin veil of bureaucratic caution. He was no longer an armed threat, but neither was he yet a person in their eyes. Officer Dana sat at the corner desk scrolling through his computer screen, not really looking for answers but pretending to be productive, while Briggs leaned against the opposite wall, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, every so often glancing at Logan like he was trying to make sense of what about him still felt off, because something didn't sit right, not in the way of criminality, but in the unnerving way the man carried himself, like someone who had stood at the edge of violence and returned untouched by panic, which was precisely the thing that now made Briggs more uneasy than anything else. Logan, meanwhile, stared at the wallplane, pale surface cracked faintly near the vent, mentally cataloguing every item in the room, every sound, every potential exit point, because years of embedded training didn't fade in captivity, even if it was administered by your own countrymen on domestic soil. The door creaked open just once when a young officer barely more than a cadet poked his head in, holding a clipboard and asking in a slightly nervous tone if they had any charges to file. But Dana shrugged and said, "We're running his background, might be stolen valor or some shady OP, who knows?" And the cadet blinked, confused, before disappearing down the hall again. Outside the interrogation room, dispatch had been flooded with calls from a dozen different locals, some defending the officers, others outraged, a few simply asking, "Did you know who that guy was?" Because the videos had already hit local social media, clips of Logan's calm demeanor, the aggressive arrest, the quiet stoicism of a man who clearly wasn't what the cops assumed, and while keyboard warriors argued back and forth in comment sections, the truth was beginning to catch up with the uniformed assumptions inside that precinct. It was Officer Monroe, the desk sergeant that night, who first typed Logan Taylor's name into the federal system properly, entering not just his first and last name, but his rank and branch, because something about the way Logan answered Chief Petty Officer Logan Taylor had echoed in his memory, like a familiar name from a news report or briefing he couldn't quite place. And when the screen populated, he stopped breathing for a moment, blinking at the long line of citations, missions, and clearances, the digital dossier of a man whose service record read more like a classified mission log than a resume. SEAL Team Lil Operator, 5 confirmed overseas deployments. Sniper leader for Operation Black Spear, still partially redacted, Bronze Star, recipient with Combat V, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, and a list of commendations that few living servicemen had accumulated, especially not ones who looked like Logan, quiet, modest, unknown outside of the circle that counted. Monroe stood up from his desk and walked down the hallway like a man who had just discovered the precinct had accidentally detained an active war hero, his heart pounding not just from embarrassment, but from the sheer weight of realizing that they hadn't just cuffed the wrong guy, they'd cuffed the guy. The one who had been on the cover of a defense intelligence briefing just 6 months ago, recognized in a classified sitrep as the field leader who prevented a diplomatic crisis by neutralizing a hostage situation involving a rogue militia and a kidnapped American diplomat in Venezuela, all without a single civilian casualty. Monroe stepped into the interrogation room, pale, holding a printout of the federal results in one hand like a white flag, and said, voice low, "Briggs, you need to see this now." And when Briggs took the paper and began to read, his face shifted from irritated to confused, then to something bordering on horror as he realized that the man he had just shoved face first into the asphalt was not only an active-duty Navy sniper but possibly the most decorated individual to walk through their station in over a decade. And suddenly the silence in the room turned thick, like it was holding its breath, everyone unsure what to do next, because what do you do when the man you humiliated in public turns out to be a hero, with direct lines to command structures you can't even pronounce? Dana sat down, eyes wide, mumbling something about how he should have said something, but Logan, ever composed, just tilted his head and replied, "Would you have listened?" And in that moment, the question cut sharper than any reprimand, hanging heavy in the stale air of fluorescent guilt. Then came the sound, distant, heavy, of polished shoes echoing down the corridor, not rushed, but deliberate, the slow and powerful rhythm of someone used to being obeyed. And before anyone could guess who it was, the main door to the room swung open with a sharp metallic creak, and in stepped a man whose very presence froze every officer in place. Pressed dress blues, silver trim, full rack of ribbons, and on each shoulder, 4 silver stars gleaming with authority. General Carter Maddox, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, known in Pentagon circles as the Reaper in the room for his unblinking decisions during critical missions, and now, here, in Falls Glen, Virginia, standing not in front of a podium or a general's tent, but inside a local police station, staring directly at the man they had cuffed like a criminal. No one spoke, no one moved, and even Logan blinked in faint surprise, because while he'd expected some kind of resolution, he hadn't anticipated the appearance of the man who personally oversaw the coordination of Black Ops units and counterterrorism strikes across multiple continents. Maddox walked in slowly, eyes sweeping across the officers, not in anger, but in that special military way of measuring men without a word, until he came to Logan, and then, without hesitation, he bent down, unclipped a small key from his own breast pocket, and unlocked the loose cuffs that still sat around Logan's wrists, then stood, cleared his throat, and said, voice steady and low, but booming in implication, "Chief Taylor, on behalf of a nation that still struggles to recognize its guardians in civilian clothing, I offer my personal apology for this disgraceful error." And then he turned sharp, deliberate, toward the stunned officers and added, "This man has served this country in ways you'll never understand. You don't cuff him, you don't question him without reading his record, and you sure as hell don't assume threat where respect is due." And the words weren't shouted, but each one hit like a strike of gavel, final and irrevocable. Logan stood slowly, stretching his shoulders slightly, his expression unreadable, but behind his silence was a storm of thoughts: relief, frustration, amusement, disappointment, and perhaps the quiet realization that no matter how many lives you save, no matter how many medals you carry, when you walk the streets of your own country in a hoodie instead of a uniform, your service disappears under the weight of assumption. The room remained still for a long moment, until Maddox nodded once more, gave Logan a look of genuine respect, the kind shared only between those who've walked through fire, exited the room with the same deliberate steps he came in on, his presence still hanging like fog behind him, and as the door shut, a single truth remained etched in the silence, that the war for respect wasn't always fought overseas, it was fought here, too, in offices and streets, behind desks and inside assumptions. And Logan Taylor had once again walked away with his head high, not because of medals or generals, but because dignity, unlike uniform, could never be stripped away. The silence that followed General Maddox's departure lingered in the air like a heavy mist, not just awkward, but dense with realization, as if every breath taken inside the precinct now carried the weight of an unspoken lesson one learned, too late, too harshly, and in front of the very man it should never have been taught to at all. Logan Taylor stood quietly in the room, his arms finally free but his soul still restrained in a subtle ache that few could see, and fewer could understand, because though the cuffs had come off, the feeling of being rendered invisible, of being misjudged by the very country he had bled for, was not something that unlatched so easily. The officers didn't know what to do, didn't know if they should apologize, leave, offer him coffee, or disappear into the wall, and so they hovered in useless discomfort, until Officer Monroe, the one who had run the correct database query, finally stepped forward with quiet sincerity, cleared his throat and said, "Chief Taylor, sir, I just want to say I'm sorry." And Logan met his eyes with a nod, not of forgiveness exactly, but of acknowledgement, because Logan wasn't the kind of man who needed apologies to feel vindicated. He needed people to change, to understand, and most of all, to remember. A few minutes later, Logan was escorted awkwardly, clumsily into the precinct's break room, which had been hastily cleaned of pizza boxes and paperwork in a flurry of nervous activity, and someone had even tried to dust off a forgotten coffee machine in the corner, as if offering him caffeine could make up for the cuffs and concrete. The general had already left the building, his message delivered, his authority exercised, and yet his shadow remained looming in every officer's thoughts, like a scolding parent who wasn't angry, just deeply disappointed. Logan sat across from a newly reassigned sergeant who, trying to salvage the town's reputation, offered him a formal apology and some vague reassurance that this isn't how we treat our veterans. But Logan didn't respond with bitterness or blaming, simply asked, "Then why did it happen?" And the room fell quiet again, because no one had an answer. No one wanted to admit what they all knew, that in the absence of uniform, the mind fills in the blanks with fear and assumption, and that to many people, especially those in power, the measure of a man is not what he's done, but how well he fits the script they've already written for him. Eventually, Logan stood and retrieved his backpack, now returned to him with the kind of care someone might use to handle a holy relic, and walked outside into the warm summer night, where the moon hung low and watchful over the small town, and the breeze carried with it the subtle scent of gasoline and pine. His motorcycle was still parked in the same place, only now surrounded by a semicircle of onlookers who had gathered after seeing the videos online, some just curious, others reverent, a few embarrassed, and as Logan approached, the crowd parted without a word, like a tide moved by unseen gravity, and in their eyes, he saw a strange mix of shame, awe, and apology, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. An elderly man wearing a VFW cap stepped forward, hand trembling slightly, and said, "I served in Nam. We didn't get thanks either, but you deserved better than this." And Logan, surprised by the rawness in the man's voice, reached out, shook his hand, and said simply, "Welcome home." Words that meant more between veterans than 1,000 medals ever could. Someone else, a teenager with tears in his eyes, handed Logan a folded American flag he'd brought from home, one that had once flown over his grandfather's porch, and Logan, unsure what to say, accepted it with a quiet nod, placing it in his saddlebag before mounting the bike in one smooth motion. And as the engine roared to life, the crowd stepped back again, giving him space not out of fear, but out of respect earned the hard way. He didn't say anything as he rode away. There were no speeches, no final dramatic gestures, just the fading tail light of a man heading down an empty road, lit only by the pale light of a town that had finally begun to understand something. It should have known all along that heroes don't always arrive in parades or dress blues, and sometimes they're the ones we doubt first, treat worst, and thank last. Hours later, in a quiet room in Arlington, General Maddox sat reviewing after-action reports from multiple regions. But his mind kept drifting back to Logan Taylor, not just because of what had happened, but because Logan represented something deeper, something harder to define, the quiet integrity of service without recognition, the steel resolve of a protector dismissed by the very people he protected, the unbearable contradiction of a warrior being mistaken for a threat in the country he defended. On Maddox, a man who had issued orders that changed the tide of wars, felt something rare creeping in, regret that even his rank, even his arrival, couldn't undo what had already been done to Logan's spirit. Meanwhile, Logan parked outside a dimly lit diner off Route 29, somewhere between the town and the base, and sat in a booth with his usual order: black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and watched the world move around him like a slow-motion film. His mind not racing, but steady, reflective, dissecting every moment of the day, not for pain, but for meaning. Because men like Logan didn't dwell on injustice for long, they transformed it into discipline, into resolve, into quiet reminders of why they had chosen to serve in the first place. His phone buzzed once, a message from a fellow SEAL. "Heard what happened, bastards. Beers waiting at the unit bar." Logan smirked slightly, texted back, "Make it to," and pocketed the phone without another thought. Because what mattered most wasn't online outrage or media apologies, it was the brotherhood, the unseen fabric of connection that tied warriors together across cities and oceans, the unshakable truth that their worth didn't require validation from those who didn't understand the cost. Back in Falls Glen, the precinct began to conduct internal reviews, hold hasty training sessions, issue press releases, and invite veterans to community meetings. But they all knew the truth. The damage was done, the video was viral, and their legacy was now permanently tied to the image of a silent man in cuffs who should have been welcomed with honor, not suspicion. And yet perhaps that was what the nation needed: not more parades or speeches, but a raw, uncomfortable look at what happens when service becomes invisible and judgment moves faster than facts. In the end, Logan Taylor wasn't just a name on a military record or a figure in a viral video. He was a reminder, a warning, and a symbol all at once, that the line between protector and suspect is often drawn not by truth, but by perception, and that sometimes the ones who walk that line with the greatest discipline are the ones we fail to see until it's too late.